My name is Nancy Dillette, and I'm an academic associate at Arizona State University and an oral historian. Today is Thursday, December 11th, 2003, and I'm joined by Noel Stowe, chair of the History Department at ASU and director of the Public History Program. And together, we're going to do interview number 2 for the Arizona City County Management Association Oral History Project. Today, we're interviewing Jack DeBolske, who served, among other things, as the executive director of the League of Arizona Cities and Towns for 40 years, from 1957 to 1997. We're fortunate, again, to be in the studios of Channel 11, the City of Phoenix cable station, which has generously offered us the studios.
Keep talking.
And
Could you pull your pant leg down?
And we're recording the, and they're recording the interview for us.
Interview too.
All right.
So we don't see that.
We're grateful for this unusually high-tech equipment to conduct this oral history interview of life members of the Arizona City and County Management Association. Our purpose is to document the lives of people who shape the principles and values and creation of the strong council-manager form of government, and to help new generations to clarify the role of the manager. So let's begin with your personal history, and let's start off with the beginning. Tell us where and when you were born.
Born in Los Angeles in 1927.
And what was your first connection to any form of public service or even knowledge of how Los Angeles was run?
Well, I guess when I started college after the service, I went into college at Loyola University in Los Angeles, and I took up political science as my major. I started learning about government and got interested in government and decided that's the career I wanted to get involved with, especially local government. I was more interested in getting into local government than national or state government.
Was there some experience you had, or was there someone you knew in local government? What made you?
No, it just seemed that it was local, and you could probably have more impact on people and things that were happening than you could at the national level. Smaller pond.
And what were some of the engaging issues at that time that you thought you might get involved with?
Well, the first issue was finding a job, which was important because I was married and had 2 kids as I graduated from college, so I needed a job, so I had to go find a job, and I got a job at the LA County Flood Control District and started out there in personnel work and administrative work. So my first impression was about local government was to find a job, which weren't too plentiful in those days.
And what were some of the issues at the time that you got engaged with at flood control?
Well, I was their personnel man, and I used to go out and interview people, try to get them to come to work for the flood control district. They had a real shortage of engineers at that point in time in our development in this country, and it was very difficult to get civil engineers to come to work for government because of the cost factors and the prices and the pay scales.
So how did you entice people?
Told them what a great organization it was. It was a good organization. It was well run. It was very efficient, effective, and it was a single purpose district, you know, to provide flood control for Los Angeles County. And it was a very good engineering organization.
Did you have some engineering background?
No, none at all. I was strictly public administration. I went to UCLA and got a master's degree in public administration after Loyola. But in the meantime, I had to get some part-time jobs to get myself through graduate school. I used to unload freight cars in East LA at night.
So your work with the flood control district comes after your Master in Public Administration degree?
Yes.
Okay.
I went directly from Loyola to UCLA.
Right.
Spent 2 years at UCLA and then was out looking for a job. But in the meantime, I had to get something to help with family obligations.
So how long did you stay with flood control?
2 years.
And then what happened?
Saw an ad in the paper in the Western City magazine, and they were looking for somebody to be an assistant to the league director in Colorado. Didn't know a soul in Colorado, but it sounded interesting. Besides that, it would mean that I got to move out of Los Angeles. And so I applied and I was hired.
What didn't you like about being in Los Angeles? Just the urban area or the governmental experience you had, or what?
Well, I was born and raised in Los Angeles, and it was a pretty nice place while I was growing up, but it got to be such a big place with so much congestion and people. I thought I'd like to try raising my family someplace else. And this was a good opportunity to try, and I applied and got the job. I've never regretted leaving California.
So what was the experience like in Colorado as a
It was
assistant?
intriguing and interesting. I really enjoyed my work in the Colorado League. It was the first time I'd ever been involved with league work, and I had a great mentor. A guy named Jay Bell was the executive director of the league, and a very dedicated, honest person with great integrity and vision and foresight, and he trained me for 2 years. I enjoyed my time there, and I learned about league work.
Can you characterize the role of the league at that time in Colorado?
Well, the league really was the organization that represented the cities at the state legislature and provided input at the legislature for local government. It also had a research arm and an information arm that developed information, help, and assistance to the cities throughout the state. And my job was to travel the whole state as a field representative and assistant to the director, so I got to travel the whole state of Colorado, learned where all the good fishing holes were, and learned about local government and how it worked. And I used to go out and represent the league at the city council meetings, and got involved in answering inquiries in the league office.
So that was a good experience in overall seeing the difference between rural and urban areas and agricultural and municipal issues.
Yeah, and the east side and the west side of Colorado is a lot like the rural-urban split in this state, or Northern California and Southern California. Western slope and the eastern slope.
Had you seen that in your flood control district work? Because Los Angeles is a big county too, and lots of different cities and organizations.
No, this was the county flood control district was a single-purpose district which provided just flood control capability to the whole Los Angeles County.
Right.
And it really didn't get involved in any of the regional kind of things other than flood control stuff. So I didn't see much of that in my position.
So what was your next move?
Well, I saw another ad in Western City magazine.
It's an important magazine.
It is an important magazine. It was put out by the League of California Cities, and it was distributed throughout in fact, all of the Western leagues were involved in it at that time in Arizona, and they put an ad in the paper, or actually the magazine, and they were looking for a director. And I thought after 2 years' experience, I had enough experience in Colorado to go be the league director in Arizona. Little did I know what I was getting into. But anyway, I applied, and I didn't know anybody in Arizona. I sent down a resume, and then I got a call from an individual named Don Hummel, who was the mayor of Tucson and was president of the league in Arizona at that time. He said he'd like to talk to me about this job. I said, fine. So I got on an airplane, a DC-3, I might add, in the 50s, and flew down to Arizona in August. Got off the airplane and opened the door, and there were the Tovary stockyards. If any of you have been around Arizona in August, when the Tovary stockyards used to be right next to Tempe, you can understand the reaction I had when they opened the hatch after a rough ride on a summer day in a non-pressured DC-3 coming out of Colorado with the bumpiness of the air at that.
I'm surprised you stayed.
And I said, who in the world would want to stay here? I soon learned that I might want to do that. I was interviewed and selected for the job, and that started out in 1957 in September.
Can you try to paint a picture or portrait of what the state was like at that time? What you walked into in 1957?
Well, little history. The former director had some very serious problems legally and ethically, and they were looking for somebody different, and I was different. I was 29, and I thought I knew everything at that age, and I was positive, and I had some background and experience in running and working with a very competent league director. So they took a chance on me, and I took a chance on them.
Mm-hmm.
You've talked about the league director in Colorado as being a good mentor, and so you've obviously thought about that. How was he a good mentor for you, and did you use that experience later on yourself?
Well, he was a teacher
Mm-hmm.
and a mentor, and would give me advice and counsel and direction, and taught me how to be a league person and provide service to cities and do research and field work and politics and legislative stuff, which I didn't know anything about.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead with you. You were starting to sort of paint that portrait of the state, the shape of things. They're wanting to make a change. They had some legal and ethical problems. What kind of direction did you think you were going to be able to take
Well,
the
I
league?
think what they wanted was a more effective organization at the legislative level, but also at the technical level. There wasn't much technical assistance being provided at that time to cities. Information inquiries were not, developed in any great extent. Surveys and reports and directories and wage and salary surveys, business license tax surveys, all those things which are now done on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to start that kind of a program, and so that's what we did. But when I was hired, I was the only employee and a secretary.
What was the relationship at that time between the league and the legislature?
Well, the legislature was an entirely different organization then than it is today. We used to have 2 senators from each county, and as a result you had a state senate which was dominated by rural interests just by sheer numbers, and the House, of course, was apportioned on a proportionate basis. But the legislature met for 60 days, and it was very efficient and very effective. Most of the lobbying was done in the evenings at the Adams Hotel by the private interests. The public people were the only people that showed up out at the legislature, and there were maybe 3 or 4 of us out there in the beginning. So that was a little different than it is today.
Mm-hmm. What can you tell us about some of those private interests? I assume you're talking
Railroads, mines, utilities, copper, and cattle. That sums it up.
Can you think of a time when a decision needed to be made and those interests came to bear on it that would give us an idea of how simple the government was at that point, or the legislature?
Well, if you wanted to get a bill passed, you had to make sure that you could pass by those special interest groups. So what you would do is go to the legislature and figure out what committee assignment you had, and in those days, in order to get invited to a committee, you had to have an invitation to come to a committee meeting. You couldn't just walk in the door. Committee meetings were closed. So what I would do ahead of time is I would go out and talk to some of the private sector lobbyists and explain the bill to them, so that they would explain the bill to their legislators that they were interested in, and to make sure that the bill got passed. So you had to pass that veil of the private sector in order to get things passed of any importance.
How did people react to you? You were 29, you were an outsider, you were from Colorado and LA.
I didn't
How did they
mention I
respond?
came from California in those days.
You had Colorado as a buffer.
I had Colorado as a buffer. But, you know, they were accepting. I was a novice, but, you know, I was eager. And I tried to play it straight. My word was my bond. And that was important in those days. It's got less importance today, I think, unfortunately. But most of the lobbyists in those days, their word was their bond, and you could trust them. They didn't always agree with you, but they would at least tell you where they were, which was important to know. And if they said they were going to be with you, they would stick with you.
Was it perceived that the league, it was mutually beneficial for the league to come on and take a different kind of role at this point? Or did you have to sort of convince people that this
Oh, I
was a
think the
positive
mayors
thing?
at that time were ready to make a move to change the image of the league and also the emphasis on legislative activity.
You've said that there were 3 or 4 public people like you at the legislature, as well as the private lobbyists. Is that right?
Right.
Who else were you working with?
Well, I
in
remember
public?
the School Board Association had some people out there, and the Arizona Education Association, I think, were the 2 that come to my mind right away.
Okay.
And the counties had some people that were there. And some cities had some people that are on and off again.
So by 1957, there's a lot of change happening in Arizona. It's after the war, kind of moving somewhat away from the extractive industries. How does the impact of that post-war period and the big boom that's happening well before 1957 play out?
Well, you know, at that time the state was growing very rapidly, and cities were annexing a lot of property in the suburban areas, and there was a lot of development in the unincorporated urban areas in Maricopa County. For example, when I started in 1957, the city limits of Phoenix in the north was right there where Central High School and Brophy at the canal. That was the extent of the northern boundary of the city limits. So the cities were a lot smaller, and there were a lot of incorporations going on. And in 1960, we got a bill passed that prohibited incorporation within 3 miles and 6 miles of another city, depending on the population. And so that in the metropolitan areas, we in effect limited the number of cities that could be eventually created within this county. Which I think was one of the best bills we ever got passed, because it really stopped us from being another LA where you've got 100 and some cities in the metropolitan area, or in Denver where you got a whole strew of counties and cities and special districts all together. And we also discouraged the formation of special districts and encouraged annexation into the unincorporated areas. And if they couldn't incorporate, for example, in those days, Maryvale was talking about incorporating, Sunny Slope was talking about incorporating, and they were trying to form a new city called Industry in the southwest part of the city of Phoenix. And with this bill, we stopped that, and it was a very effective piece of legislation that's still on the books and has been through the Supreme Court, so it's still valid.
And did you take leadership in developing that idea, or was it a combination?
I stole it from New Mexico.
Okay.
So it's nothing new, but I got it passed through the legislature, I guess, by maneuvering and getting the votes we needed. But it was interesting. The special interests were very interested in getting that bill passed too, because they felt I was right when I said you know, if you could have fewer units of government, you'd probably have more effective and more efficient development of services in the metropolitan areas primarily.
Mm-hmm.
So they were encouraging it too. So it was, the timing was right, the politics was right, and it was the best thing we could have done for the state in the long term.
Sounds like Arizona was poised in a good position to be able to take advantage of not being rooted in a tradition that would lead toward many cities and towns. So the actual time frame that you came in, you were able to make some important, profound decisions that would shape the way the state and the cities and towns would grow. And just incorporating a good experience in New Mexico as opposed to being rooted in a system that had already developed here.
Well, there wasn't much here. So we had it was fertile ground for change. And you know that as far as the council manager's form of government is concerned, in the 50s we had to get a bill passed that authorized the council manager form in general law cities and towns, because only charter cities could have the council manager form prior to that legislative enactment. So we were able to make some changes. Back in the 60s, I think the figures were, let me look here, there was 60 cities and there were 20 council manager cities. And now there are 88 cities and 80 council manager cities. So we've gone from a state that had pretty much a few council manager forms of government, primarily in the larger cities, to a state where almost everybody is council manager form of government now.
Can you talk a bit about that council manager form of government and how at that time it was really perceived as the way to go?
Well, I think the city of Phoenix had a lot of impact on that, because the city of Phoenix was a very effective and efficient organization at that time and still is today, and is a forerunner in the council manager form of government as being a good government form, and a number of cities would like to emulate that. But in the outlying areas, a lot of the smaller cities and towns had city clerks or town clerks, which in effect were semi-managers, and they in effect was the individual that everybody revolved around in terms of getting things done within that community. And as we worked with them, we encouraged them to think about adopting the council manager form of government. And in later years, we did a lot of codification of ordinances for all the cities under a federal grant we got. And we were able to encourage the cities, when they were redoing their code of ordinances, to adopt the council manager form of government. And a lot of the town clerks and city clerks in the smaller communities became city managers or town managers. A lot of them did not have the background and experience that the managers have today, but were very effective and efficient in those communities in which they grew up in. A lot of them were local people, knew the community, knew the politics, were able to maneuver the system into place, and it worked very well.
So not long before you got here, in Phoenix, the Charter Government Committee had kind of swung into action. Can you talk a little bit about how Phoenix became a place that was known as a well-run city? What were some of the ingredients for that?
Well, they had to have a political reform group develop in the, I guess it was in the 50s, before I arrived, when they used to turn over managers every year or two and police chiefs. And Phoenix was not a place that you would want to write home to mother about as being an efficient and effective delivery of public services, and the political environment was not something that you would say, this is what we want to aspire to. Trying to be kind. But then the charter government came into being. It was set up by local business community and special interest groups that wanted to develop a better city. And they ran a slate to be the the mayor and council, and they won and hired a guy named Ray Wilson to be their first city manager. And from then on, we had professional management in the city of Phoenix. And it's been that way ever since, and it's been in the forefront of in the United States as being one of the best council manager cities in the nation.
Were there some early successes or early dramatic changes that occurred as a result of installing this form of government that made everybody understand it's going to create a big difference?
Well, the quality of service improved significantly, and the political environment was a lot better than it was prior to the charter government coming into power. And the charter government continued on for many years, I think at least a decade or so, in making sure that the people that were running for mayor and council were of the same mindset to develop a good form of government delivering services, and nonpartisan form of government where we didn't have partisan politics enter into local government.
So that first generation was able to install a set of values and principles which later took hold.
And kind of, permeated throughout the whole state of Arizona, really.
Can you talk about what those values and principles were that really came and made a change?
Well, I think integrity of the administration and the integrity of the city council and the mayor, looking at services, not the politics of the situation, trying to worry about the next generation and not the next election. It's the best way to put it.
Were there some examples or anything that stands out in your mind that would be a good story about how the city manager form of government really changed, and you were looking more to the future and less towards politics? Was there a particular
No, I don't think there was
episode,
anything,
or-
there was no particular episode or idea that comes to mind that would say that, that this was the reason. I think it was just, the timing was right, we were growing, we needed competent, technical capabilities to deliver public services in a more meaningful way in an expanding community. And you had to have competent people to do that, and the only way you're going to get competent people is have a competent organization and leadership in that organization. And the council manager forum provided that. And as a result, people began to adopt it and accept it as the hallmark of the way to get things done in Arizona and local government. In fact, if you look at the contrast between the counties at that time and the cities at that time, I don't believe we had any county managers at that point in time in the 50s at all. It was all purely a political situation run by the Board of Supervisors. And incrementally now we have developed county managers in almost all the counties. The same thing has happened because of the way the cities were run. That permeated into the county structures as well.
How about in Tucson? How would you characterize how Phoenix and Tucson were similar or different?
Well, Tucson is partisan elections. That's the fundamental difference between the city of Phoenix and the city of Tucson. And also, in those days, the city of Tucson had the ward system of electing their councilmen, which was fundamentally different, and they elected Democrats and Republicans as councilmen and mayor. And the politics in Tucson were a lot different than they were in Phoenix. And as a result, you had an entirely different environment, but you still had a pretty strong council manager form of government there. And you had mayors at that point in time that were very interested in maintaining that council manager form of government. And that's true until today. But it's in a more partisan way, but it developed in a little different way than it did here in Phoenix.
You've talked about when you first arrived in Arizona, there weren't very many council manager forms of government, and the clerks were very, very important. In working on things like you've talked about in this legislation, codification, whatever, are you doing a lot of work with the clerks, or how should we think about that in terms of what the league's business is and its relationships?
In order to develop a good relationship with the cities, we worked very closely with the city clerks and the town clerks in the rural areas and the managers that were out there, because mayors come and go, but the town clerks stay there for quite a while, and as a result you get to know them and they get to know you, and there's a lot of communication that goes on between the league office and the town clerks and the city clerks and the managers. And when you're developing legislative policy, we always tried to work through the managers or the clerks in order to develop that continuity and have the manager or the clerk make sure that the mayor and council were informed as to what was happening in those days.
Were the clerks organized in an association that was effective for lobbying?
No.
Okay.
We did most of the lobbying. The managers didn't do any lobbying, or the clerks either.
Okay, but there is a clerks association, right?
There's a clerks association, there's a managers association, there's a police chiefs association, a fire chiefs association, a public works association. There may be a couple more that I can't remember right off the bat.
In Arizona, we have a very high percentage of state and federal government land. So how did you become so effective in working through the legislature to get the funding to come to the cities and towns?
We didn't get it from the legislature.
You didn't get it from the legislature?
No, I went out there and put my head against the wall for several years trying to get additional funding for cities, and I couldn't get it done. So we went to the initiative, which made me very popular at the legislature to run an initiative campaign, getting additional sales tax for cities. We did that, I think, in the 60s.
What was the first initiative that you staged?
Well, we ran an initiative to increase the share of state sales tax going to cities and towns from, I think, 15%, I think it was, to 25%. And we went out to the legislature and asked them to pass that, and they said, no, thank you. We said, thank you for your consideration, and went out and circulated a bunch of petitions and got it on the ballot and ran a campaign, and cities then received 25% of the state sales tax. We took it from the counties, so they were unhappy with us too. But that's all right, we had the 25%.
So this
but I was not very popular for a while, but they soon forgave us.
Well, yeah, what was that period like when you're getting this united front of the cities and towns, and you're sort of flexing your muscle and making things change through initiative?
What was it like? Well, it was a little disconcerting occasionally, and sometimes you had friends and sometimes you had enemies, but most of the time people didn't take it personally. It was just a professional, opposition or support. We survived.
So what was your reputation like at that time?
I was the city son of a bitch. Well, that's true. Then
there must have been a fair amount of respect for what you were able to envision and accomplish.
Well, I don't know that. You'd have to ask somebody else whether they respected me or not, but I slept nights. Then of course, when we got into another initiative, that made things a little hotter when we went after the income tax. The city of Phoenix was talking about, this was in the 70s, I believe, we were talking about the local income tax at the city of Phoenix because they didn't have enough money to run the city operation effectively and efficiently. So the city of Phoenix was poised to develop an income tax locally, and I felt that it might be better if we could get a statewide program that got income tax to all the cities throughout the state. So we developed an initiative, or a legislative program to give the cities a percentage of the state income tax and preempt local government from developing a local income tax. I thought that was very marketable. We went to the legislature and we developed a bill and had a formula that allocated the revenue based upon poverty levels and population and economic impacts, and it was a very good bill. Passed the Senate, passed the House, went back for amendments, and the Senate was passed, and then went back to the House to be okayed. It died by 2 votes. In the wee morning, it was 2 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday morning. We lost the bill. I was not feeling too well. We spent a lot of time and effort on it. We regrouped, went out and circulated another initiative petition, put it on the ballot. Cities received a percentage of the state income tax, 15% of the state income tax. But we couldn't put the formula in because it was too long. It took 2 pages. And that would have had to gone on the initiative petition, so we put the money where the people were. It's called population. And that's what we have today. And that made us unhappy. That made several legislators unhappy because we took the money out of the state treasury at that point in time. But we preempted the cities from levying local income tax, which I think was a good move. We'd have had all kinds of problems if we'd had an income tax in various cities throughout the state. You know, where do you collect the income tax from? The people where you live or where you work. That's been the problem nationally, where you have local income taxes. So it's worked out very well for cities and given us a pretty good base for state shared revenues in the state.
It sounds like it's really the first time that this statewide perspective is really coming for the state. The state is, all the cities and towns are really operating for the good of the entire state. What is the reputation of Arizona at that point? Because I know it has to compete with a lot of other Southwest states to attract businesses here. So are these moves helping for the state to be seen as a place that's good to do business, fair government, progressive ideas?
I think we have one of the best local government systems in the country here in the state, and I think that's known throughout the business community and the governmental community in the nation. And I think it has accrued to our benefit that we have an effective and efficient form of government. I'm glad to see the counties are shaping up too. The counties used to be kind of a really problem area for our local government, but they've improved significantly over the last few years and becoming very effective in their delivery of services too, and that's because they're going to the council manager form of government again.
Were you personally involved in recruiting city managers for the cities and towns?
No.
In Arizona? How did that come about?
Recruitment policies?
Yeah.
Well, what they do is they put an ad in the City Management Association monthly bulletin that comes out for job interviews, and they advertise in the paper and then put it in Western City Magazine in those days. But the league did not get involved in selecting city managers or encouraging city managers to move from one city to the other. We always took a neutral position as to whose manager. We were for the winner.
So you were supporting the form of government, but not necessarily the
not the individuals.
personnel and the individual. But at the same time, you were creating a reputation that a good city manager would want to come to Arizona.
That's right.
So you were able to attract
We were able to
good
attract good
professionals.
quality people to come in as B managers, and that's been to our benefit, I think. Arizona is noted for being a very good place to work as a city manager. And you can just look around the state and see the managers that we have, and the tenure of managers here is very good too. You don't have the constant turnover like you have in some states.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about the league staff consisting of you and a secretary when you first came. The league staff has grown. Now have people who have worked in league offices gone on into city management around the state and elsewhere?
Yes.
Okay.
They're all over the place.
So there's an influence then of the league in helping to prepare people for city management work. How should we think about that?
Positively.
Okay. But that also means that you've helped mentor people and the league has helped train people in that sense of training.
Yes, that's true.
Okay. What are some things that the league and you as the director worked to instill in people who came to work for the league and as they moved on into these positions?
Integrity, your word is your bond, and make sure that you understand the consequences of your actions today in the future.
One of the things you talked about was that your experience in Colorado was somebody teaching you about research and developing reports or whatever, let's say, and then you've talked a little bit about the league. You talked about wage and salary surveys and things like that. Is this something that you brought to the state as the director of the league, that it moved into that, and is that part of the training that's involved here?
Yes.
Okay.
But I just copied what other states were doing. It was nothing, that I developed on my own.
Mm-hmm.
I could look at wage and salary surveys from other leagues, and I would just develop one locally for here, or business license tax surveys, or other kinds of surveys or reports or things that were done in other state leagues. We have a network of the state municipal leagues, and the state municipal league directors meet once a year and in a technical session and an administrative section, and we discuss our programs and what we get involved with.
I was thinking about how one might think of the league as it's developed here in the 60s with you as director, and one of the things you've talked about is the lobbying work and working on some specific things, but the other aspect is this more hidden aspect, perhaps, to the general public about reports and surveys and whatever. Is that do people think now of turning to the league for this? How do they
yes.
think? Okay, so.
Well, the present director of the league is an expert in technical assistance, Kathy Connolly. She knows everything about everything as far as I'm concerned. She's one of the best. And they rely on the league for legal opinions, for technical assistance and all kinds of things. We did codification of ordinances for all the cities, and so we've been involved significantly in the development of local government in terms of technical assistance in various ways. We also set up a liability insurance pool too. When the liability insurance rates were skyrocketing, and in fact some cities couldn't even get liability insurance, so we set up our own liability insurance pool, and that's done very well. And that's another technical assistance kind of a thing, but you spun it off and got it going, and now it's on its own, and most of the cities now are involved with the liability insurance pool and purchase their liability insurance. And then subsequent to that, they set up one for workman's comp at the same time. Mm-hmm. And so they're working on that at the same time. Those are examples of the kinds of things that they've done over the years.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the forces that would have an impact on the council manager form of government. one thing being the district, going from at-large to district. Can you talk a little bit about how, maybe give an example of where that came about and how that would change the actual delivery of services? And
Well, you know, when the original council-manager form of government was started back in the early days, somewhere way back when, the idea was that you elected a city council or a town council, and that town council would then select the mayor from among their number, and then that mayor and council would then select a manager who would then administer the city. That's in theory. Well, that started out okay, but it's been, you know, developed a little bit in a different way now, where almost all the cities now directly elect their mayor. And that's kind of the sign of the times, and I don't think that's changed the council-manager form of government. A number of the cities now, as they're getting bigger, are going to ward systems, or district systems as they call them now. And I think that changes the politics of the council, which can have a significant impact upon the council-manager form of government if it isn't kept under control. Because, you know, you think of the ward system, you think of Chicago, and Lord help us, I don't think we're interested in having, you know, the Tammany Halls or the Chicago politics moving into Arizona. I guess, in my opinion, I think that threat is always there with the district system or the ward system, more so than it is with the at-large system. But I think so far we've handled the district system pretty well. But personally, I'm not a fan of the district system unless you're a very large city where you really need some district representation. I don't think that the smaller communities really need a district system for an effective delivery of political administration of the city itself. You can still get impact of the smaller communities and an at-large system. But when you get the size of the city of Phoenix, you're probably looking at a district system as a necessity, just from practical political reality.
So,
but that has an effect on the way the manager operates in those cities if you're dealing with a district system than when you're dealing with an at-large system. I think one of the most significant things that was happening in the city of Phoenix was the way the city of Phoenix administration handled the change from the district system, from the at-large system to the district system. They ought to get a gold star for the way they did that, I think.
tell us about that transition and how it was handled.
Well, I think you ought to talk to Marvin Andrews about it, who did it.
We will.
But in my opinion, he did a class act when he did it. I mean, it was very professionally done. And, you know, through education of both the council and the staff at the same time, to develop an input process that was capable of handling that political change in the policy way that you elected council for the city of Phoenix.
Mm-hmm. And that was put up for a public vote to adopt that change?
Yes.
From at-large to district?
Right.
Was that a contentious public process?
Not too contentious, I think, at the time they did it. But some forces were in play to try to make that district system come to be, and they won. Personally, at the time, I was not in favor of it. I liked the at-large system. I would like to have kept it. I also would like to see some city that is thinking about going to a district system to go to a numbered seat system. I haven't talked anybody into doing that, but for example, instead of having 6 districts, you have 6 council seats that run independently of one another and a mayor. And when you run for the council, you run for one of the 6 seats. You don't run as a group like the at-large systems do. What you do is you run for seat number 1 or seat number 2 or 4 or 5 or 6. And let's say you're a very effective council person and you're in seat number 1, nobody will run against you. But to say that seat number 2 has got a weak councilman, there may be 3 or 4 people who would run for that seat. I think that would mitigate the effectiveness of the ineffectiveness of the district system, but would still allow for people to get more feeling that they're electing individuals to run for the city council rather than the at-large system.
Where is that in play?
I don't know of any city that's got it in play. That's a DeBolske theory.
So you're constantly thinking of innovation and change to lead toward efficiency and what makes sense in a particular situation. How do you balance the stability of a community and the history of a community with the need for always taking these risks and making change?
You know, a city is like a human being. You know, you're either going up or you're going down. There's no plateau very long. So you've always got to be going up the hill. If you're not going up the hill, you're probably going to go downhill. And you may have some downhill, and then you got to go back up again. But you got to continually move forward, in my opinion. I don't think you can stay on a plateau and say we're going to stay here forever, because that isn't the American way, or that isn't the traditional local government way. You're always in for change and new ways of doing things. You know, when my granddaughter comes over and helps me with my computer, I didn't learn the computer when I went to grammar school. We didn't even have calculators. We had slide rules. Remember the slide rules?
Yes.
Calculator was a thing of the future. So things do change. And I think for the better in most cases.
But there's a dichotomy there, because if you're in a permanent position in civil service, there's a tendency to want not to make change. But you're suggesting that change is inevitable and needed and useful and to be encouraged.
I think you can change a bureaucracy with good leadership. And that's what the council manager form brings to the city or the town, is that leadership capability on the administrative side. And that's the gem of the argument in favor of council manager form of government.
Can you talk about that in terms of this illustration of Marvin Andrews dealing with going to the district system? Because you mentioned some forces that were alive in the community that encouraged the district form. What were those forces that were present?
Well, the principal forces were the Firefighters Association that wanted the district system established in the city of Phoenix and in other cities in the valley here for political reasons. And from their perspective, it was a good move politically. And that was one of the forces that brought it to bear.
Okay, that's a political force then. What about a force like just sheer growth? Because you've mentioned that city size apparently has something to do with for citizens feeling a part of things. I would gather that from something you said.
Well, I think you had a lot of people that wanted their own councilman.
Okay.
And you reach a certain size, they feel that the at-large system, you know, you got a group of people and they don't know anybody, and the councilman doesn't know the district that they live in as well as a district councilman would know it. So I think that, you know, you got forces that were brought to bear that said this was a good idea, other than the firemen, but the firemen were the one that were principally involved in circulating the petitions and getting it developed.
Arizona has tremendous growth in its future because of what's happening here with movement of people in. Is that force that causes this to come up in these cities going to be a factor in all the cities? Is that something that's inherent here in the 21st century, that everybody's going to have to confront districts, wards, or having to come back to your idea of numbered seats?
I hope they think of the numbered seats, But I think you're going to see more and more districts come into play in the suburban cities. Well, you got it in Glendale, you got it in Peoria, and I'm sure there are several others that I don't remember right now. But I think you'll see it in a lot of cities. I think Mesa's going to the district system too.
And Scottsdale's considering it.
And Scottsdale is considering it, yes. So I think that'll happen, and hopefully we can handle that in the same way we handled it in Phoenix and in the other cities. The other cities have done a fairly good job of working with it. As the cities grow bigger, and it's probably a natural thing to happen. But I would encourage them to think of the numbered seat instead of the district system.
In terms of the technical assistance of the league, what kind of technical assistance is it able to provide to deal with this kind of transition as cities do this in the council manager forum?
Well, I don't think we get involved with that kind of a technical assistance program. That's.
Well, I was thinking, is there anything in the way of surveys, reports, codification that the league support? I'm not thinking of proactive as much as just simply supporting the transition.
No, I don't think we were involved in that,
okay,
to my memory. It was too political and partisan.
You've talked a little bit about the effect of the shift from at-large to district. What about the effect of full-time city councils?
I think that has a significant effect on the way you administer a city and deal with the issue of council-manager relationships. I think the managers have to spend a lot more time with the council if they're full-time. And you have more meetings, as the larger you get, the more meetings you have to go to. In the good old days, in quotes, the council used to meet once a month in the rural areas. Not anymore. Things have changed. I mean, the whole dynamics of local government have changed significantly over the 40 years that I was involved. And it's more on a day-to-day basis and more council-manager relationships that are needed to be taken care of if you're full-time. And then the council then gets a staff, which then complicates the issue because you got to deal with the staff as well as the council on the management side. So it's a much more difficult situation for the managers, I think, as they're dealing with that issue on full-time. A challenge, as they call it in the business.
But overall, is that something that you saw as a positive force to go to full-time? It's harder to deal with it from a management perspective for the city manager, but in terms of it being an effective way to go for running the city, is that something positive in your experience or not?
I think it's inevitable. I don't know that you get better government by having a full-time council than you do of a part-time council, but maybe you reach a certain size. Again, size has a lot to do with it. That it's almost necessary because of the political considerations of the council that it's a full-time job. But in some cases, it's not necessarily a full-time job, but they create full-time jobs out of it. It's like our legislature. People are talking about having a full-time legislature. I say, Lord help us. They're there every day. I think all we have to do is look at California as the classic example of what happens to you if you have a full-time legislature. I'm for a part-time legislature. In fact, I would have a system where you give the legislators, half their pay the first day that they walk in the door, and you give them the other half when they leave. And if they got their work done on the time frame that you set up, you give them a bonus. If they don't get their work done on time, say within a certain period of time that you set, then you start deducting so much a day from their salary that they're going to get when they finally get their work done. Now, if you set that system up, you would probably get your work done within a specific period of time, because most of the major decisions in the legislative process are made in the last 2 weeks of the session, no matter how long it is. So all you're doing is running around in circles until the last 2 weeks to make the major decisions. So it doesn't make any difference when you make the major decisions, whether it's 60 days or 90 days or 120 days or 300 days. It's the last 2 weeks that count. So I think you need some incentive to get the legislature to get their act together and make the decisions that they make. Because, you know, no politician wants to make difficult decisions until they absolutely have to. And that's at the local level, at the state level, and that's at the national level. I think you find that same thing is true.
Let's talk a little bit about a specific issue where everybody from the state, from cities and rural and urban areas, had to come together to adopt the groundwater management plan. Can you talk a little bit about how that came about, the need for it, where did the pressure come to create one, and then the process you undertook?
Well, in order to get the Central Arizona project authorized and developed, we were told by the federal government that we had to develop a groundwater management act that would stop the overdraft of the groundwater basins throughout the state of Arizona where you had significant urban populations. And we had a groundwater law that was not very good. And so there was a committee formed to try to develop a new groundwater code. And they passed a law setting up the Groundwater Commission. I was selected as one of the members of that commission to represent local government, along with a gentleman named Bill Stevens, who was an attorney that represented a lot of the cities in this metropolitan area. And that commission included all kinds of people on it, legislators, special interests, farming interests, you know, utility interests, mining interests, city interests, and ranching. And everybody was involved in trying to develop a process that would come up with a bill that everybody could live with. We met for several times, and under the direction of Bruce Babbitt, who was the chairman of the committee, got very little progress. And all we got was a lot of arguments and disagreements and consternation in the ranks. So they formed a rump group, as it was called in those days. It was a group of us representing the mines, the farmers, and the cities. And Bruce Babbitt as the chairman. And we met for, oh, I guess it was 6 months in a secret meeting, which you probably couldn't do today, at Bill Stevens' office. And we hammered out a bill that everybody could live with. I lost a few pounds, lost a few hairs, turned white, but we got a bill passed, and we sent it to the legislature on the condition that if they changed any of the words, we wouldn't agree to it. So they passed a bill with no amendments. And the governor, I think, was significantly involved in that process and probably should get most of the credit for putting that together. We had some very rough meetings. And the press, I think, understood that at that point in time it was the only way we could have possibly gotten that bill passed and actually got it developed and then passed. And then we went out and sold it to the legislature and said, this is it. And the mines, and the farms, and the cities, and the governor, arm in arm, and we all agreed that we wouldn't, cut and run and try to get amendments. And that had to be, your word was your bond in those days. And our word was our bond in those days, and that was the reason we got that bill passed.
It's interesting because I would have thought that by 1979, 1980, there's already a backlash against unlimited growth, and people are looking forward to conservation measures. Was the interest of conservation also represented at those meetings, or was it still really the mines, ranchers, and cities?
Well, I think most of the conservationists in those days, or I shouldn't say most of the conservationists, some of the conservationists didn't want the Central Arizona Project at all. I think that was the extreme. And they thought the Central Arizona Project would cause too much growth in the metropolitan areas and would be damaging to the state as a whole. I think the other view was that we needed the Central Arizona Project to continue growth in the metropolitan areas, and if you're going to have any kind of reasonable, controlled growth, then you're going to have the Central Arizona Project water available. But one of the things that we did get in the groundwater code is a requirement for a 100-year water supply. So you can't develop where you don't have a 100-year water supply in the groundwater management areas that are under control. Now, not all areas of the state are under control. Only where you have the huge metropolitan areas do you have the Groundwater Management Act in place, where you've got to have a 100-year water supply, and I think Prescott has the same thing. But in the rural areas, that doesn't apply. And in Pinell County, it doesn't apply, which I think we're going to rue the day we didn't have it in Pinell County.
So looking back now over 23 some years, how has it functioned well, and what are some regrets you might have about it?
Well, I think the thing that I like the best about it is that we got the Central Arizona Project, and we got a 100-year water supply requirement in there to make sure that we've got enough water to handle our urban needs. And I think with some of the amendments to that bill that have come along for water storage that they're doing now, I think in the long run is going to benefit our state to a great extent in the future as we come into the shortages in future years, just like we're going through now, where we're banking the water in the underground and then going to be drawing it out. So I think it's worked very well. I think the interest groups that were together at the table really looked the long range as to what eventually would happen. My only concern was that I tried to talk Bruce Babbitt, you will appreciate this as historians, I tried to talk Bruce Babbitt into letting somebody from the ASU historical or history department or somebody from the political science department sit in on those meetings and develop kind of a history of what went on and the trade-offs that were made. He wouldn't agree to it. So that's my one failure, I think, was to get some kind of an historical, I guess, a record of some kind or other as to what went on in that meeting, because we're going to have to revisit that whole process at some point in time in the future. And when we were going through the records of the previous groundwater code, we didn't have anything to go on. We had no history. We didn't know what happened and why it happened.
Can you talk about some of the trade-offs?
No.
Well, I was thinking of the issues that things turned on. Can you talk about those?
Well, I think the issue turned on primarily how to pay off the farmers for the water, because they had the water under the old law. If you owned the land, you could pump the water. So the question was how to compensate the farmers in a reasonable way without costing the cities too much money to acquire the land. And that was worked out eventually in the groundwater code. There were give and takes on all of it.
From the city's point of view, what kind of give and take issues were you balancing back and forth?
Money
Money.
and rights to... In Tucson, there was an entirely different situation with the water than there is in Maricopa County, because we have the Salt River Project here, and they don't have the Salt River Project in Tucson. They're strictly on well water, underground sources, and now they're beginning to get CAP water in there. And they had some well fields that were outside their service area, and there was liability for those wells with the farming interest in that general area, and we had to work around those. It was a little more complicated in Tucson than it was in Maricopa County, because we had surface water available for certain parts of the valley here.
How would a place like Anthem fit in to the groundwater code?
Well, I think they're buying their water from the Indians, I think.
Doesn't that run antithetical to the idea of a 100-year water supply?
No, they got a water supply.
So it wasn't specifically written in the code where that water would come from.
Well, I think
wasn't
we're
tied
going
to
to,
the
one of
land
these
there.
days, we're going to wake up and say, I'm back home in Los Angeles. I think the more if we go out further and further, the more difficult it's going to be to have any semblance of order in the metropolitan area. I guess when I reflect on some of the things that maybe we should have done, you know, I think back to Valtrans. If we'd have passed Valtrans, we might have an entirely different urban imprint upon this valley than we have today. Unfortunately, it didn't make it. It was 20 years too soon. Now we're coming back to it in a very different way, not in a regional way that we had envisioned under the Valtrans issue. Unfortunately, we lost that one. Badly.
There was tremendous opposition.
Still tremendous opposition to mass transit. And I think that eventually we're going to have mass transit in this metropolitan area. I remember, you know, in California, when I was a young lad, we used to ride the streetcars and the red cars. We had a metropolitan rail system in Los Angeles County called Pacific Electric Railroad. Went from Huntington Beach to San Fernando to Pomona, you know, all over the metropolitan area.
Big red cars.
Big red cars. And the city of Los Angeles had the yellow cars, railroad, the street railway. We got rid of them all. Now we're putting them back in the same place we took them out of. And we developed a freeway system, but we aren't developing a transit system to go along with it. And I think we're going to be in the same position as Los Angeles. We're going to have to do it eventually.
That wasn't something, when you came in 1957, Phoenix was already devoted to the automobile, but there wasn't much of a highway system. And that really didn't take hold until much later than other metropolitan areas.
We had a great highway system throughout the state of Arizona that could get you every place except in Maricopa and Pima County. And that was because of the legislature and the way they allocated the funds that were available. And then when the federal government came up with all these metropolitan programs where they started developing more money available, they required us to set up regional planning agencies in the state to access those funds. And that's where you got these councils of governments that we have in the state. We set up, you know, the Council of Governments program in the state through the governor's office by an executive order. Jack Williams was the governor at the time that did that and set up, I think there's 6 or 7 COGs, as we call them. And the League worked on developing those organizations, and we set up each organization a little differently depending upon the local wishes. But all of them have management committees that set up, in effect, a council manager form of COG, which is somewhat unique in terms of what's happening throughout the country. And I think it maintained control of the cities in each of these councils of governments. And that was my job, to make sure that the cities maintain control of the council of governments.
I'm sorry, can you clarify that the city would maintain control?
Well, by voting. Mm-hmm. If you have voting systems set up where you got each city gets a vote, you got more cities than you have county. So in a sense, the cities, through the management and the management committee and the regional council, is set up in such a way that you run everything through the management committee, just like you do in a city where you have the council manager form of government.
Mm-hmm. Was that a system that you developed unique to Arizona, or was that done also elsewhere?
I don't know that it's done elsewhere. We just developed it here locally. Thought it was a good idea, and it survived.
So at the same time that you were executive director of the League of Cities and Towns, concurrent with that, Maricopa Association of Governments is formed, and you play a role in that as well.
I was the secretary, or the principal executive. It was called a secretary in those days. And I did that too. I had a staff that worked for me as the League. Then I had a staff that worked for me as MAG. And we contracted with the state to do a lot of the transportation planning in the early days. Now MAG has its own transportation planning staff. So it's evolving too. It was an interesting horse to ride. Mm-hmm. Being a secretary or an executive director of a COG in a metropolitan area is like riding a bucking bronco. Dennis Smith has my great admiration for riding that bucking bronco right now.
How does it come to be that transportation and mass transit are so controversial when everybody's a transplant from an area where this is not a new topic? And so how does it come to be a controversial topic here in...
We love our cars.
Okay.
You know, the most efficient and effective system of mass transit in the modern world today is your personal automobile. If we didn't have too many of them, it wouldn't be too bad. But unfortunately, we're getting so many of them that we can't fit them in the environment that we're living in. One of these days we might have more cars than we have people. We keep going the way we're going. But it works. You know, you walk out the door and you open the door of the mass transit vehicle that's available to you, turn the key, and you start it up, and it goes where you want it to go without any stops, except if you got a traffic light or something that you got to stop. No, you don't have to pick up extra passengers if you don't want to. It's very efficient and very effective. And as long as you can survive in that kind of an environment, people are going to accept that. Unfortunately, we're reaching a point where the densities and the congestion are such that we're going to have other means of getting people around the metropolitan area. That's called mass transit. Mm-hmm. That's for all those other people. That's how we view it. As citizens. But it'll come home to roost one of these days, and we'll dust off Valtrans and look at it again at the cost of millions more than it would have done if we'd really done it in the first place.
Mm-hmm. From your perspective, looking back over the 40 years that you've served and shaped the state and the valley, Was there a critical time frame within which there was a shift from, there was always a mentality to try to grow the cities and towns? And at what point was there really a shift to not simply to grow them, but to really guide how they were going to grow?
Well, we had to get an Urban Planning Act passed through the legislature. I forget what year that was, but we had to get a bill authorizing cities to develop a planning process. The person that helped me do that was a person named Sandra Day O'Connor when she was in the legislature as a senator. She was one of the principal supporters of getting that bill passed. We've got that bill passed, and we set up, planning requirements and general plans and specific plans and those kinds of things. The cities are now all developing their master plans and working as best we can with that. But I don't think we've got the tools that we need in place. Government doesn't run the urban growth process in this state. Mm-hmm. That's controlled by the private sector pretty much. And that is good and bad. I think there's a combination where government is kind of trailing behind where the development is occurring. And when we only have so many acres of land available, you're going to go where the land is available. The principal land developer in this state is the state land department. They've got more land than anybody else, potentially, for urban development. We're going to have to work on that issue a little more, and I think they're beginning to think about some things now to make that system a little better.
How about we take just a 5-minute break?
Sounds reasonable to me.
Okay. Okay with you?
Fine.
Okay.
I gotta wait and I get unhooked, don't
Oh
I?
yeah, I forgot.
Don't stand up.
Don't move.
Let me see where we are. Did you want to actually get up and stretch and move?
No, I'm good.
What did
Okay.
you want to do, sir?
I
'Cause I cannot.
We never would have had the impetus to do it if we hadn't had somebody threaten us.
It's usually when we do things, right?
That's exactly right,
Okay.
Okay.
Do you want to do that first?
All right.
Fire away.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit more about the negotiations that went on with developing the Groundwater Act and some of the kinds of issues if historians had been there, what they would have been hearing about that it's important in the long term we know?
Well, of course, the most important thing was the Central Arizona Project. We had a gun at our head as a state of Arizona that if we didn't develop some reasonable accommodation for the overdraft of the underground basins that was continuing on in that period of time, we're not going to get the Central Arizona Project through Congress authorized. Mm-hmm. Secretary of Interior was very firm about that, and I think that's what gave missionary zeal to Bruce Babbitt and other interests to come together to sit down and try to work something out. Tried to work it out in the open, but it was too contentious to have it discussed in an open setting. It was too much posturing and political processes going on in the open and people taking positions publicly, and there was no negotiation possible. And the only way you're going to get negotiations is to go off in a private meeting sense and sit down and try to work out your differences. And that's what we did between the mines and the farmers and the cities. Those were the three principal interests that were involved. And it was necessary to get accommodations on all three sides. And the only way you do that is by hammer and tong negotiations. It's like anything else you do, whether it's labor management or water. But, you know, the water in the West is the most volatile issue that you can talk about. And while we were trying to negotiate in the room, everybody was on the outside posturing and positioning, and different parts of the state were concerned that, you know, they were getting sold out, and, you know, it was a difficult time, but we got through it okay.
You talked a little bit about the cities had some turning point issues and the farmers did. What were turning point issues for the mines?
Water.
Just the water itself?
The water itself in order to operate the mines. And primarily because they were using wells that were off their site of the mine, and they were transporting the water across the basin. And we had to authorize the transfer of water across the basin line. And that took some negotiations. And then primarily the farmers were the ones that had the water and had the court cases on their side at that point in time. So we had to get the farms and the mines and the cities agreeing. And that wasn't easy. Took some time and some talent and some firmly flexible people.
Who were the firmly flexible people who exerted some leadership in the room, besides Babbitt?
Well, we had the representatives. I don't want to name names. I don't think.
Okay.
I don't think that's from the private sector. I don't think that's fair. But we had people from the farms that were representing the farms and the Salt River Project, and we had the mines represent some of the major lawyers for the mines, and from the cities there were Bill Stevens and myself. Those were the main interest groups in the room. Mm-hmm. And they were all principled people, I think, which was very important. I mean, there were no second-grade people in that room. They were all professionals, and their word was their bond, and we agreed to certain prerequisites that had to be met in order to develop that kind of an environment, and everybody lived up to it.
Can you tell us who was in the room besides you and Bill Stevens and the governor?
The mines and the utilities.
Okay. No,
but you can find out.
Yeah,
you can find out. There's a list of the rump group someplace.
Good.
How was it that it was able to take place without public knowledge or input? How literally did that come about, that you were able to negotiate in private?
I think primarily the threat that we had facing us was such a great impact upon the economy of this state and the political environment of this state that people were willing to allow this to happen. And I think the timing was such that it was still possible to do that. But, you know, legislatures still meet privately in secret meetings at the legislature. They have their caucuses and things like that they still do. And I think the leadership of Bruce Babbitt enabled that to happen politically. He was the cover because he was the public person that was there representing the overall state, mm-hmm. trying to bring these warring groups together in some kind of a reasonable compromise. And that was the criteria that we needed in order to develop that process.
Mm-hmm. But from a Democratic point of view, there's really only one elected official in the room.
I don't remember. Technically, yes, but around the outskirts was Bruce Babbitt and Stan Turley. They were there too, so occasionally back and forth, and Alfredo Gutierrez, mm-hmm. and mm-hmm. so there were people around the process.
Was there a way that you were able to share a common vision of Arizona's future that actually led you to be able to negotiate this, or was it still really
it was water,
just representing current interests and needs for water?
It was current and future interests for water.
What was
there was no great vision of what Arizona was going to be like 50 years from now.
In terms of water, I mean.
In terms of water, that's what I'm talking about. It was purely, how much did we have to give in order to get what we needed? And that was from all three sides, from the farms, the mines, and the cities.
But that was to get what they each needed to what? Sustain similar practices to not change in the future? Because
Well, the mines wanted to continue to develop the mines and mine their properties that they were presently prohibited from doing because of some court cases. The farms had the water and didn't want to give it up without a commensurate price. And the cities wanted to continue providing water to urban areas of the state in a meaningful way at a reasonable price. Those were the issues.
Mm-hmm.
If I remember correctly, the governor was quoted, or I'll paraphrase here if I can remember this, saying it didn't matter what historically people had the right to have, but people had to turn their thinking around and look at where Arizona was at that point and not act as if the state didn't have any population or had a very small population, but recognize where it was and then negotiate and move along those lines, which isn't really looking ahead to the future, but it's recognizing that the situation's changed. Is that a fair assessment?
That's a fair assessment, and I think that the farming interests, I think, are reduced politically, because of the just sheer fact that we're urbanizing a lot of the farmland. And as farmers are going out of business, as we used to say, they're selling their land and going over to San Diego and growing martinis with the profit they make from selling their land. And that had an impact. I think the future of farming is not very good in the metropolitan areas. It's all being urbanized long term. But we still have a significant farming economy in this valley, but it's compared to what it was 50 years ago, it's entirely different.
Were the tribal communities represented in all of this discussion, or were
No.
they outside in the adjudication process?
Well, they were in the federal adjudication process, not the groundwater process.
Okay.
So we didn't have to deal with that issue.
Okay.
It was complicated enough.
Well, the Gila River adjudication was underway at that time, correct?
Right. Well, we had adjudications all over the place
Mhm.
with Indians in various and sundry parts of the state with water, and we're still doing it.
So it wasn't up for grabs to talk about how mining operations or farming operations would change to deal with less water. It was that at all a part of the equation?
Well, we talked
the
about laser
techniques
leveling, of farmland in southern Arizona, in Tucson. They do laser leveling because the water is so expensive. Where they don't do laser leveling up here all the time because water's not that expensive up here and it doesn't pay economically to laser level your farm. So that was involved, but that was involved in the criteria for how much water you could transfer.
Mm-hmm. How about in terms of municipal use? Was it a target that there would be conservation measures? Or
Oh
that
yeah,
we
there's
would
targets
have
in the groundwater bill for conservation to be implemented in the urban areas. And there's conservation in the farming too, so it's a very complex bill.
So this is all part of those turning points and those issues
Right.
that they focused on.
But the bottom line was water and money and continued economic development of the mining industry.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about, this is skipping way back in time, but the difference between the general law versus the charter city and the kind of legislation you had to get enacted to go to the council manager form of government.
Well, this was in the early 50s. I think there was a law passed that authorized the council manager form of government in general law cities and towns. Prior to that time, there was no authority to do that, and they set up a requirement in the state statute for general law cities and towns to organize up only in certain ways. So they got a bill passed that authorized the council manager form of government to be set up in general law cities as well as in charter cities. Charter cities can adopt any form of government they want. You can have a dictatorship or a ruling oligarchy or a mayor-council form of government or a council-manager form of government. There are no limitations on the framework of government for charter cities in Arizona. So they could set up council-manager form. But the general laws, cities and towns that were not chartered could not.
So who was instrumental in bringing that bill?
Well, this was
About.
before my time, so it was the league that did that.
But it was the league, through the
Right.
league,
Mm-hmm.
to support that form of,
Right.
okay.
But then we moved from when you arrived from a few cities, council manager, we get a whole lot.
Mm-hmm.
And so the league takes real leadership in that.
Very quietly.
Very quietly. Any changes in the law needed to accomplish that?
No. It's just a matter of encouragement and exampling and developing the concept that we're changing and you need to change the form of government a little bit. But in many of the cities where they adopted the council-manager form of government, they had a very strong clerk situation, which in effect was a semi-management situation, except it wasn't legally recognized.
Mm-hmm.
Extra-legally it was recognized, but legally probably not in some cases. But we had some awful strong city clerks and town clerks around the state that pretty much ran the community.
So is the issue that helps to bring that quiet discussion along, let's say, the growth of that community in size and complexity, and so you were able to talk about those issues then, perhaps?
Right, and also the increased demands for public services in the cities and the smaller communities of the state, where as you grew, you wanted more services and more services were made available at the local government level.
So the argument would be this is really beyond what a city clerk or county clerk or something the clerk does, is that?
That's right. When you start having a lot more full-time employees too in a city, and you grow to a certain size, and you got to have somebody there full-time watching and administering, and not just doing the clerk's duties and being there taking the minutes of the council meeting and things like that a clerk has to do.
So this is you then talking to a member of a council or to a mayor type person? Is that how one would think of this?
Well, and also at the league meetings we would talk about the council manager form of government and, you know, encourage it. And when we did the codification of the ordinance, as I mentioned before,
Right.
we would suggest that possibility. And I remember Nogales, for example. It took me 20 years to work on the change in the charter in Nogales to get the council manager form of government in Nogales. But we worked on that. We had, I don't know how many drafts of their charter, and that was a charter city to encourage them to think of a different form of government because they were having administrative problems in the city. And in my opinion, the only way to solve that is to have a council manager form available to that community.
When you dealt with something like the codification issue, over the years, were there particular people in the legislature who stand out to you, who were helpful in being sympathetic or empathetic with what the goals of the league were? You mentioned Sandra Day O'Connor at one point, for example.
Oh yeah, there were legislators, there were former mayors, and you know, there were former councilmen that were in the legislature, and also some very decent people who were strongly in favor of local government. What you find in the rural areas, local government is a lot closer to their elected representatives in the legislature than in the metropolitan areas. It's much more complicated in a major metropolitan area. For example, a legislator has a smaller district than a councilman does, I believe, in Phoenix. So it's kind of interesting.
Interesting phenomena.
Yes, it is. I don't think we need more legislators, or I don't think we need more councilmen either, but you know, that's just a fact that actually the state legislator has a smaller area to represent than does a councilman.
You brought up Nogales as an example of a place that took a long time to shift to the council manager form of government, which brings up the issue of the border the Mexican border. Was the league involved in working with border states in Mexico?
No, not really. They have I think it's the Border Commission, Arizona Sonora Border Commission, I think, is the one that does most of that. We weren't involved in international stuff with Mexico at all.
Okay, even for a place like Nogales that would, have such an obvious relationship with a Mexican state and city?
No.
No. What about the Professional Management Association that is developing, I assume, along the same time frame, the Arizona City County Management Association? As the league and others are playing a role in installing the council manager form of government throughout the state, and you mentioned that Arizona gets a reputation for being a leader and a good place to come for that form of government. Talk a little bit about the Professional Management Association that serves the managers.
Well, it originally started out as a small group of people getting together and discussing, problems in manager cities. And it's grown significantly since then, and they've developed their own organization pretty much separate and apart from the league, yet housed at the league, supported by the league, and in fact staffed by the league on a reimbursable basis. So it's been a professional development as the size of the organization has grown and the membership has grown. It's gotten a lot more professional than it used to be. But at one time it was difficult for small town managers to get away to a meeting and be able to discuss things openly and freely in an environment where there weren't people looking over their shoulder all the time. And that was the whole concept in the beginning to get it started. And I think it's grown professionally significantly and very positively in the future here.
So does Arizona still enjoy a reputation of a leader and an innovator?
I think so. I'm prejudiced, of course, but I think they do, yes.
And is there anything that threatens that role in the future, or do you see systems set up to keep it innovative and moving and not stagnant?
Well, I think we've got to continue to get good people serving on city councils and mayors, and we've got to get good people serving as managers and staff for the manager. And so far, it's worked out pretty well in both cases.
Is the field, in general, the professional field, in good shape from your point of view in order to attract younger people to public service?
I think so. I think ASU's got a very good program, and U of A has a very good program too. And NAU is working on a program, and so I think the universities have been very cooperative in developing the kinds of people that we need in order to continue that flow of new entrants into the profession on a yearly basis.
So you don't see any major threats?
No, I don't see any major threats. There's always going to be, as the cities grow bigger, you're going to find pressure to have strong mayors. Stronger mayors. And that's going to always be there. Now, is that a threat? I don't think so. I think that's a natural evolution of the process, just like at one time we didn't elect mayors directly. Now we elect almost all the mayors directly. Did that threaten us? No. But did it change the system? Yes. Like going to the district system, did that threaten us? Not really. But did it change the system? Yes. Will a stronger mayor threaten us? No. But will it change the system? Yes. But I think you've got to evolve that system to meet the criteria that you're dealing with on a daily basis, and on a yearly basis, and in the future.
How about the fact that with growth, which is part of what this is causing this to evolve, brings people like us to Arizona who are from different areas and our experience in growing up with city government or county government can be quite different from what exists here in Arizona. How do you bring along a very diverse population that's just coming from every place? And how do you evolve that? How do you involve the public, the citizens, along with the professional management staff and with the city's council members and with mayors and the staffs and all of that? You have to bring the citizens along too. So how do you do that?
I think it's up to the cities to do that on an individual basis, and I think most of them have citizen participation programs that develop those, and those have come on very strongly in the last several decades now, much more so than it used to be. It's like social services. You know, cities weren't involved in social services. All of a sudden, they're more now in the delivery of social services. It used to be, you know, bricks and mortar and pavement, and police and fire. Now you're into the social service arena, and you're in the citizen participation arena. Those are evolutionary things in terms of the delivery of public services and input services too. Input from the public to the council is significantly changed over the years. And this is an example, when we're in the studio, is an example of the significant changes. In 1957, I don't think there was a television station in a city. Now there are several in the state.
I was thinking, you came from California, I came from California. There's a strong city manager tradition in that state. But if you came from a state where or from a large city and no participation like that, where how much more important the citizen participation would be. Whereas before, if I arrived and I expected this, I would understand perhaps about citizen participation. But if I came from an area where there wasn't anything, I'm wondering if these trends towards citizen participation is a form of really citizen education, and dealing with some of these social services as a way of compensating is the wrong word perhaps, but coping with this different kind of citizenry that's coming in that hasn't heard of this before, and you need to get them involved. And
I think most people that come from the East say, thank God we left our local government behind. I mean, it's such a breath of fresh air in our local communities with openness and the lack of partisan political politics that I think they really appreciate local government a lot more than the people coming from California where they're used to it. That'd be my reflection on your problem. I think that our cities are very open, and I think there's a lot of publicity about the good and the bad that happens in cities. I mean, you just read the newspaper and they generally have a litany of some good things occasionally, but they got a lot of things that are wrong and are bad and that have happened in cities. But it's open, and people know about it, and they know about participation programs and involvement programs.
It strikes me, though, that whereas I would have an expectation, if I came from a certain kind of area, particularly with the demographic shifts that are coming, if someone doesn't invite me in, I'm not going to learn about the openness and the participatory process that's possible to me. And it would strike me that might be a difference from things in 1957 when you arrived and where we are in 2003. It's just different challenges, different opportunities.
Well, I don't think there was much citizen participation in 1957 compared to today.
Okay.
I think that in certain cities there were more than others, but most of the time it was, you're in the smaller communities, you were trying to get people to run for office. Now you're finding a lot of people that are willing to run for office. I think it's a significant difference in the numbers of people that are willing to serve. And that's progress, I think, in a positive sense, that more people are open to run for local government now than it used to be. In the early days, it was difficult to get people sometimes to run, even to put their name in the hopper in the smaller communities.
Can you talk about the shift a little bit? We've talked a lot about the impact of growth in general, but the changing demographics have also really changed the state. Can you talk about how women and minorities have come into the, well, two things really. One, how the changing demographics have changed city manager, council manager form of government, how that's been a challenge, and then also how new people have come into the profession, which apparently used to be a fairly white male-oriented world.
It was. It's changed significantly, and for the better, I think. I think if I have more participation now from minority groups that are in both elected and appointed offices, and I think you have more females in elected and appointed offices than you used to have. And I think that's an evolutionary change. And you know, the trouble is we got so many smart women around that there aren't a few jobs for us white guys left, you know.
Was the league, excuse me, was the league or ACMA involved in recruiting women and minorities into the profession?
We used to have a minorities in management program that we ran for several years where we got minority students into the graduate programs and paid their tuition and books and stipend. Mm-hmm. We also hired minorities on league staff and women. Smartest thing I ever did was hire Kathy Connolly. I always figure, you know, in order to achieve in this system that we're in, you've got to hire people that are smarter than you to work for you. And that was one of my keys to success, in my opinion. I was brilliant in that one aspect.
And what did you see as, how would you characterize people being smart? How would you recognize that and know it and trust that they should be in a position to work for you?
Well, you'd interview them and get a feel for them and determine whether you think that they're the right personality and the right intellect and the right long-term goal of what they wanted to achieve. And
so is it a very intuitive kind of process for you?
Yes.
And you trust that intuition?
It's worked. Haven't had many failures, very few. Mm-hmm. Most of them are successes. A lot of them are still around.
Are there some people or events, or I guess both of those, people and events, that have had an impact on you about how you've fulfilled your two jobs as with the league and also with MAG? Are there a constellation of people in the state or in the nation or in international management that have really had a big influence on you?
Well, I think the biggest influence I felt was from the elected officials that trusted me. We had some awfully good political leaders in local government over the years, and still have today, that are interested in the next generation and not necessarily the next election, as I say. Mm-hmm. And as a result, they put a lot of trust in you and in the league business to accomplish things. And you know, like the groundwater management thing, you know, there was a lot of trust in that when you send two guys in a room to represent you for the whole state and all the cities in the state. And that trust relationship was necessary in order to develop the end product. And in a lot of cases, you know, that's the way it works. Mm-hmm. with associations when you don't have, the day-to-day contact with people. You have maybe 4 or 5 meetings a year and discussions with your president quite a bit. But there's a lot of trust factor that goes along with that. And if you don't have the trust of your elected officials and the support of your managers in the state, you can't achieve as a league, in my opinion.
Okay, I think we've asked.
I'd like to
anything
go
else
back.
you wanna add?
I'd like to go back to MAG for a moment.
Uh-oh.
Okay. Well, we've talked about transportation, and what we didn't talk about was really what Valtrans was, and we might take a moment just to say what it was, because we've alluded to it here, and people didn't vote for it, and it was a broad regional concept. It didn't take hold, and so what weren't people responding to? I think we might.
Well, I think you got to go back one step from Valtrans, is that we got the half-cent sales tax passed for freeways.
Right.
Through the legislature and then to the people locally, which in effect requires the citizens of Maricopa County to build a state highway system, which is always kind of stuck in my craw a little bit. As as somebody living in Maricopa County, I'm building the state highway system, which should really have been built by the state, by local government financing the state in order to build a system that should have been built by the state and paid for by the state. But once we got that passed, then we moved on to phase 2 to look at what we could complement that freeway system with. And that was the Valtrans proposal on a regional basis to have a major impact upon the urban imprint of the valley by providing mass transit on a valley-wide basis, which would not be on the existing right-of-ways. Would be separate and apart from the existing right-of-ways. And it was a far-reaching concept that I thought should have passed.
Why didn't the voters buy it?
Too much opposition. Just like there's opposition today with mass transit.
Mm-hmm.
There was more opposition because this was a bigger program and too grandiose and wouldn't pencil out and is not economically viable, and there's too much subsidization. But what we don't realize is we subsidize freeways to a huge extent. But it's somehow or other we want mass transit to fund itself, and it's never going to fund itself. Never has and never will. Maybe in the early days it did, but not in today's environment. So you're going to have to subsidize it just like you do highways and streets.
Was it the local press that was
No,
mostly in opposition?
I think it was just about everybody else. I think there were a few supporters of it at the time. I think it was 2-to-1 in opposition, something like that.
Now we're leaving the impression that MAG only deals with transportation. It deals obviously with other things too.
Oh, air quality and social services, and we did surveys of the homeless. And
so when you started with MAG as secretary, what was its
transportation was the major issue.
transportation? And so all these others have come on over the years?
Oh
then?
yes.
Okay.
Open space planning and regional planning and social service planning and air quality, environmental concerns.
Mm-hmm.
All those things were involved in that process. It's a very difficult job.
Okay.
Anything that we haven't covered that you want to add?
Well, I have a theory of how our government operates. It's called the DeBolske theory of government in the United States. And it goes like this. That level of government that I am on is good, honest, and pure. That level of government above me is generally doing it to me, and that level of government beneath me needs watching and control. Now, when you really think about it, you know, we got the 3 levels of government in this country. The feds don't trust anybody, and they mandate on state and local government. State government gets mad at the federal government for mandating on the state government, yet they turn around and mandate on local government. Our problem in representing local government, we haven't got anybody to do it to. End of criteria.
I think we'll close with those
Okay.
words.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I better sit quietly.
Creative.
Yes. Not me, but-